I don't know where to even begin because Bronya is my favorite character of Honkai's universe. I mean, after all, Silverwing is what got me interested into Hoyoverse in general. Bronya's own history boils down to being a character so broken she literally had to be directly power creep in most team scenarios to get players to roll for newer Harmony characters. This isn't just including Sparkle, but every other 5-star Harmony character as well. Now there is a few things you must understand about Bronya leading into the release of Honkai Star Rail. First of all, Bronya was the only character with a game-breaking tech that would be removed leading into the game. The tech would allow Bronya to have a more skill point efficient playstyle and give herself tons of energy, which resulted in having 100% uptime on her team-wide ultimate buffs. Nowadays, the only character that can retain these buffs 100% of the time is Clara. But to be able to keep the uptime on the massive crit damage and attack buffs would make Bronya not only best in slot with every character, but a must pull. Now to play devil's advocate here, while being an interesting tech that was founded by the dedicated closed beta testing players, it would be a tech that was overbearing and needed instant tweaks. You ever wondered why Bronya isn't able to give herself action forwarding with her own elemental skill but still plays the animation and gives a damage buff despite that? Yeah, so Bronya was what I considered to be heavily nerfed leading into the launch of the game, and this change would affect every other character that had action forwarding going forward into the future of the game. Despite Bronya receiving substantial nerfs, while not having very many options residing in the path of the Harmony, her kit would still function as intended, which was a mostly single target offensive buffing character. Now compared her to the rest of the cast, Bronya would have a kit that outclassed every other character at launch, which would formulate the Bronya reroll meta. If you were a player at the time of launch, you understood the value of rerolling in Honkai Star Rail, and considering how much more efficient it was to do so in Star Rail compared to the previous Hoyoverse game, it was all the more valuable to do so. You only had 4 ways of obtaining Bronya: the standard banner, the standard banner 5-star selector, the limited banner, and or the beginner banner, which ended up being the most realistic option for every player that wasn't willing to spend money on the game. Considering at the end of the Star Rail tutorial, you had 40 rolls to reach the pity on the beginner banner. It would mean after about 40 minutes of playtime, you would have a 1 in 7 chance of retrieving Bronya upon each reroll instance. Not achieving Bronya this way meant you realistically had super low odds of receiving this character unless you circumvented the RNG sooner rather than later, and this would be what I considered to be a do or die situation. Considering how much further ahead Bronya would put your account compared to those that didn't, create a FOMO environment. Bronya was literally needed in order to create the hypercarry team composition alongside Ting Yun, which was to be Star Rail's first real long stay meta. Bronya alongside Ting Yun provided the strongest buffs possible to a single damage dealer, with the limited character at launch being Seal. You would very quickly see exactly how much further ahead this exact team would be compared to the damage output of others. As for the defensive option in the hypercarry team, it truly didn't matter, but the best in slot would be Bailu, as her synergy with Bronya was unmatched. Bailu not having a cleanse in her kit would mean that some scenarios will make Natasha a more appealing character, of course depending on the damage dealer used. Bailu not having a cleanse in her kit did not matter alongside Bronya because the damage dealer in the said hypercarry team composition was going to be the one that Bronya would always use her elemental skill on. And with the cleanse it had alongside the action forwarding, it would make up for the shortcoming of Bailu. Part of Bailu's irrelevance even to this day is because of her synergy with Bronya. What this also meant is that this variation of Bronya hypercarry team had no inherent weakness, and without a doubt, it would breeze through all of the content offered in the game. Considering Seal was the first limited damage dealer, the bar for damage potential was effectively raised, and this would be raised even further thanks to her synergy alongside Bronya. Bronya would give a nice damage boost and action forward to Seal, whom would then kill the enemy and get an additional turn upon elimination of said enemy. But thanks to the passive of Seal, she would easily retain the buffs provided by Bronya, as her resurgence was just an extension of her own turn. The 1-turn buff didn't matter so much unless the character would have delayed damage, and in hindsight, this would be the start of Bronya's downfall, which makes a lot of sense considering Honkai Star Rail nowadays. Despite the high speed of a character like Seal versus the low speed of a character like Bronya, was the fact that Bronya, much like Seal, had many ways of increasing her own turn action values, which in turn gave her the means to keep up with even the fastest of characters. Bronya also utilized the Wind Launch Relic set that would give action forward to the wearer upon utilization of the ultimate. This in combination of the 25% free action value after a basic attack would allow Bronya to give more buffs consistently, and not be as heavy on the skill point economy if you decide to go down this high investment route. The release of Jing in the second half of the launch patch would signal the beginning of the end for Bronya, we just hadn't known it. Jing was the only character to have delayed or backloaded damage in his kit. Considering he's a character that functions best in hypercarry team comps, missing out on the damage buffs for the mass amount of your damage at the time would result in Bronya for the first time not being the best in slot character for said variation of hypercarry. On the contrary, it also meant you still had a best in slot offensive supporting character for one of your teams in the hardest content the game had to offer. What this also further meant is that a character as broken as Bronya would only have a few flaws in her kit. she was not only a character that was harsh on the skill point economy, but she had 1 turn duration buffs, which would make her a side grade for some characters in the future of Honkai Star Rail. And lastly, Bronya would be a character that was first and foremost a mainstay in the hypercarry team composition, so she would be known as the Queen of Hypercarry. Hypercarry is the only team comp that Honkai Star would have at launch, so this was not a foreseen issue at the time. Everyone was just enjoying their investment into Bronyas. This Bronya-dominated meta would be further reiterated with the release of Bronya Jr. in the first half of patch 1.1, and we called this the Brony meta. Upon her launch, Silverwolf was a broken character, and very much so is still to this day. I mean, after all, like her older counterpart, she fundamentally changes the way you play the game, considering Silverwolf had amazing single target debuffs that boost the overall damage of every character, and still was still the single target damage dealer that shared the same element as Silverwolf. The best team in the game would become even better. Now, while Silverwolf mostly has a designated role as the pillar of quantum teams, she quite literally functioned nicely as a second support for every damage dealer in hypercarry teams alongside Bronya. This also would phase Tingyun out of the team comp and gave her a comfy stay in the Jing hypercarry secondary team you'd use for Memories of Chaos anyways. This Brony meta would continue on and actually remain the best team for Seal until the release of the better Bronya in later versions. For the time being, you just replace the defensive option with a better character in the short term. The second half of patch 1.1 would be the rival Luocha, whom replaced the defensive option in the current Bronya hypercarry, as he provided a consistent skill point every turn, which would help further the shortcoming of Bronya on the skill point economy. But this would of course matter a lot more with the release of Star Rail's Golden Child. With not much else happening, the Bronya hypercarry team would receive a possible replacement of the damage dealer with the release of Blade in the first half of patch 1.2. Considering Blade's skill point neutral playstyle, he would mesh very well with the Bronya hypercarry team alongside Luocha and Silverwolf. Bronya giving additional turns and elemental damage buffs to Blade meant that he would become a Bronya dependent character. Star Rail didn't have any characters that provided a health boost at the time, which meant the mass amount of attack buffing supports was a no-go for Blade. Therefore, Bronya, whom mostly provided universal buffs with the exception of attack buff on the ultimate, would make her a mainstay for Blade hypercarry teams. Bronya Jr. providing wind weakness and damage boosting debuffs would make her the other best supportive. The second half of patch 1.2 would also signal the shortcomings of Bronya further, as the release of Kafka illustrated future characters which would formulate team comps outside of hypercarry. But at the time, these team comps would only be off meta, as their damage potential was even close to that of Bronya dominated hypercarry meta at the time. Kafka could work alongside Bronya because of the damage and attack buffs that was provided, but this pairing would use 2 skill points every turn of Bronya, which gave Kafka a sizable damage boost but burned through the skill point economy in record timing. Ultimately, Asta became the best installed character to the Kafka teams, as she was slightly less aggressive on the skill point economy and gave buffs to the whole Kafka dot team. Considering Asta was a free 4-star character, no one would complain. This would then signal that a character on the tier Bronya would be needed for the dot team, and that character would release later into the game's lifespan. The fall of patch 1.3 would bring the highest damage potential for a damage dealer yet, and the reality of Star Rail was utilizing the best supports to maximize said damage. Bronya would mesh well with Denheng Buto Nai, as the faster skill point efficient build would capitalize on the slow nuker style of this new damage dealer. Despite Daniel being a character that required a maximum of 3 skill points most turns, the existence of Luocha and Tingyun helped offset the greedy nature of the hungrier characters. Around the same time period, some players would have an extra duplicate of Bronya and or her 5-star light cone, allowing the character to fit even more comfortably alongside this hungry damage dealer. This team would then go on to be the best version of hypercarry in the game, which, considering the amount of imaginary weak enemies in the game, would make every other damage dealer alongside Bronya feel bleak in comparison. This team would also signal the difference between a well invested into Bronya versus that of a less invested into one. Whether that was through RNG or less understanding of resource management, the gap still existed. There would be more implications of the shortcomings in Bronya for those that weren't so fortunate. Around this time period would also be the arrival of Fu Xuan that would shake up the general roster for every single team composition. The most important one for specifically Bronya would be the Seal Hypercarry, and with this team specifically, it would be the closest we were to a future-proof team. The thing is about Bronya's interaction with Fu Xuan is that of the buffs provided by Fu Xuan would be dependent on the turns of the Diviner. This meant that Bronya could reliably spam her skill without worrying about buffs expiring because of the constant turns you'd take. It beat using Jetport in the same team alongside Bronya. Considering the many turns that Seal would take herself, Fu Xuan would make this team all the more comfortable, and this team would then go on to be one of the fastest and most consistent teams in the game. The perks of having Bronya in the same team also meant a small damage boost, crit damage, and attack percentage to everyone on the team, which in combination with the critical rate provided by Fu Xuan, created a team damage shift more so than hypercarry. The main damage dealer, of course, would deal the most bulk of the team's damage, but the implications of this meant that the future potential of the team would be further with the release of a quantum Harmony character. What would also appear in the same patch was the speed set, which would make building Bronya and every other support character a lot easier. Having a free 6% speed would ease some of the pressure for building Bronya with high speeds to be a much more efficient character in the skill point economy, but also maintain ultimate buffs and keep up with the fastest of damage dealers such as Seal. The release of the speed set would be the biggest buff for Bronya in my honest opinion, because it would give every player the opportunity to meet the speed criteria without having to deal with as much RNG as previously. This patch would also feature the release of a new planar set that gave a large amount of free effect resistance to Bronya, which helped her resist debuffs more often in combination with the effect resistance she received from her traces. Once Bronya had 10% more effective resistance from relics, she would then give a non-conditional 10% crit damage boost to everyone on the same team, which would raise the effective damage ceiling further. Things were looking nice for Bronya as she was still top of the meta, even so still to this point. This would also put pressure on Hoyoverse to have to do something, anything, very soon for the long-term health of the game, because the damage ceiling from Bronya hypercarry comparative to the ceilings of other team compositions was a large difference. The release of Jinglu would multiply this difference tenfold though. Jinglu had an interesting interaction alongside Bronya, because not only did Jinglu have the damage potential rivaling that of Daniel, but she also had the skill point neutral design of a destruction character like Blade. Considering Jinglu also had a kit that would give herself a massive attack boost from the drainage of allies' HP, the massive amount of damage boost provided by Bronya would make up for that shortcoming. It's almost as if the two complemented each other. This would also be the same time period in which players that had invested heavily into their Bronyas early on had extra ice relic sets lying around, which saved the hassle of farming. And for min-maxers, this was a dream come true. Even as the planar sets used for both was a part of the same simulated universe world, saving even less time on farming. Last but not least, for the hardcore players, the interaction between the two characters meant that a 1-speed slower Bronya than that of Jinglu would keep the character in her enhanced state at all times in the fight, giving a constant DPS uptime on the team composition. In the best utilization of Bronya's kit we had seen from a damage dealer yet, this would become Bronya's best team comp, which is still even so to this day. The release of Topaz would be much like the release of Jing. The character did not benefit as much as other damage dealers, as Topaz also had backloaded damage. This would change however with an Eidolon 6 Bronya, but at the time many players wouldn't realistically have lost a gacha pity to Bronya that many times, so expecting players to pair the two together wasn't happening. Woe would release in the first half of 1.5, and for Bronya specifically, this character would allow her to get her ultimate much more often. Having a defensive option give energy and attack to everyone in the team flowed so perfectly with hypercarry, which was focused on giving as many buffs to a soul damage dealer as consistently as possible. More energy meant faster rotations, and more attack meant more damage. This would be another major improvement to Jinglu hypercarry teams, Daniel teams, and the upcoming physical erudition character. Now, Argenti was a damage dealer that had a more expensive ultimate compared to that of any other damage dealer we had seen yet. There's two things to note about the interactions between action value characters and slow damage dealers. Giving more turns to a damage dealer will allow that character to regenerate energy faster because your attacks give you energy per turn you take. For Argenti's case, his energy is amplified because he regenerates energy per enemy hit by his attacks. This also meant that having a character give you action value would essentially be your substitute for speed boots, which in the case of Argenti would give the character the option to wear attack boots and raise his damage ceiling further. Argenti, much like Jinglu, would be one of the biggest offenders of Bronya, and following the release of an upcoming Quantum Harmony character, you would have a unique team dynamic that no other damage dealer could utilize as well. On the same banner as Argenti, there would be a 4-star named Hanya. Yeah, this forgettable character would replace Bronya in teams where you needed a ton of skill points such as Daniel hypercarry. Making up for the shortcomings of being a character that gives skill points instead of constantly taking them away would make Hanya the safer and more consistent option for Daniel teams. Because the longer the fight went on in the Bronya version of the hypercarry Daniel team, the less and less skill points you would have for your damage dealer. This would also be nice for those that still couldn't obtain Bronya or want to slot her in on another team, because at this point Jinglu and Daniel were still running rampant in the DPS category. Ultimately, Hanya's overshadow of Bronya was short-lived, but this gave even future prospects to what teams could be like had a 5-star version of Hanya existed for the greediest of damage dealers, and if said character existed, they would dethrone Bronya in those teams. Now ultimately for some teams, notably Jinglu Bronya hypercarry, it was to improve with the release of Ruan-Mei, because to be brutally honest, Ruan-Mei's buffs were strong enough to replace a second Harmony character in hypercarry teams. However, Ruan-Mei would shine in teams that allowed the character to maximize her team-wide damage buffs. In other words, any team that had more than one damage dealer. Kafka Dot and follow-up were to see a sizable improvement, which allowed these teams to lessen the gap between hypercarry and off-meta quirky team compositions. Now, this wouldn't be enough to dethrone Bronya teams in any way, not even close, but it gave some more future insight into Bronya being a character more niche than previously thought. This will also be around the time where discussion were had comparing both Harmony 5 stars to one another. It was inevitable, as Star Rail players at the time wanted to min-max their roster, but in this particular scenario, it was heavily dependent on the characters and team comps used by the player. Realizing there was teams outside the usual hypercarry format the players were familiar with, Bronya really didn't take a direct hit until the release of Star Rail's next major update, the Penacony planet. We were getting close to a year at this point in which the game was still stuck in a Bronya hypercarry centric meta. However, the first two limited characters of the new region would directly bridge the power gap between not only hypercarry team comps, but also Bronya and other characters. Black Swan, being the first of the newer characters, was an absolute monster alongside Kafka for the dot teams. And in combination with Ruan Mei, literally everything was to get eradicated. Look at me using big words. In all seriousness, having two very strong damage dealers in the same team with the most universal team buffer would finally bridge the viability gap between Bronya hypercarry and damage over time. Even to this day, alongside Ruan Mei, this team shreds any floor of the hardest contents the game has to offer, regardless of the elements because of Ruan Mei's resistance's penetration and Black Swan's defense reduction. For once, we could say that we were finally out of a Bronya hypercarry focused meta and instead centering the game around playstyles, which is more or less what Star Rail has always been centered around, but not in terms of optimal team compositions. This feeling of not being restricted to using mostly Bronya would be brought to limelight even more following the release of the Quantum Harmony 5-star Sparkle. This character was direct Bronya power creep. The only team in which this wasn't the case was Jinglu hypercarry. And some of those characters needing an offensive support that can allow backloaded damage to take advantage of buffs, it would show exactly how much better Sparkle was across the board. Sparkle would give better buffs to the whole team that was longer lasting, which allowed her to be a viable option in teams that had more than one damage dealer, much like Ruan Mei, with how much easier she was on the skill point economy. Jing, QQ, Daniel, and Seal were to be the characters that benefit the most from Sparkle, and the full Quantum team would turn into this future-proof team with the removal of Bronya and the addition of Sparkle. Argenti, however, being the supreme outlier, would actually prefer using both Bronya and Sparkle in the same team because of the extra skill points and energy that was given with the extra turns Argenti would take with both buffers in his team. So while Bronya still had her uses with certain characters following the release of Sparkle, this number would be bleak in comparison to the amount of Team Sparkle improved. Almost a year into the game, Bronya has become a more niche character than how she was towards the launch of Star Rail. Given that this was a long time coming, Bronya still had the benefit of time on her side, as getting Bronya was more feasible to the average player as a standard banner 5-star selector existed. And even at this point, you may receive the 6th Eidolon of Bronya, which opens up her flexibility to many more team comps in the game. As it stands in current Honkai Star Rail, Robin did release in patch 2.2, and with her being known as a follow-up attack dedicated buffer, that means characters are becoming even more niche and better in those niche scenarios to make said character more enticing than existing options. This isn't inherently a bad thing at all because having more playstyles be viable is great news, and with the fact that the release of Robin allows a full Harmony setup because of her built-in dance, hypercarry can still coexist comfortably in the meta. So there you have it. What was once the best character in the game is now no longer the best character in the game. The bigger they are, the harder they fall, which is the best way to summarize Bronya. A character so powerful, Hoiverse had to directly power creep her to get the average player to roll for more Harmony characters. Thank you for watching and have a nice rest of your day.